The regime in Tehran knows that the prime threat are not necessarily foreign soldiers, but their own soldiers. I mean, we're essentially in a world now where you can do whatever you can do. I think the liberal international order is dead. You know, you often hear in the West, well, you got to win the hearts and minds of the people in order to win conflict. But if you're a dictatorship, that is simply not true. You can absolutely bomb people into submission. Trump does whatever he wants. I mean, Trump is completely unconcerned with any type of international norms. That can be quite dangerous and quite threatening to many of these dictators. So just because you take out one man doesn't mean that the entire regime is going to fall. So the primary threat to almost all of these non-democratic regimes is their own military and it's their own intelligence services. Whenever you're not a democracy, you're always at risk of being overthrown by your own people. And the US can't be replaced. I mean, love them or hate them, we were very comfortable. We told ourselves that we no longer fight wars, military power is no longer important, and all of that is over.
Hello, Marcel, and welcome to OSTpolitik Studio.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Today we are joined by Marcel Dirsus, a political scientist and the author of How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive. He also hosts The Next Best, a podcast on politics and global affairs. Worth checking it out. In this episode, we will talk with Marcel about the durability and the fragility of authoritarian regimes. So let me ask the first question right away. Marcel, in your book, you argue that many non-democratic regimes are more fragile than they appear, that the very strategies rulers use to protect themselves can also make those systems more vulnerable over time. But today, when we look at Iran, a regime that has been in power for like 47 years and has survived war, sanctions, repeated waves of protest, can you explain what that tells us about the balance between durability and fragility in authoritarian systems? Like, can we use Iran to discuss this balance between one and the other, or that's not the case?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few things that we can see in Iran that are almost exemplary for the structure of these regimes in general. Although, of course, it has to be said that all of these regimes is, they're not the same. So Iran is not North Korea is not Russia, and, Russia is not China. But essentially what you have in these regimes is that they're constantly a threat. Whenever you're not a democracy, you're always at risk of being overthrown by your own people, or if you're a dictator, perhaps even by the people closest to you. And in order to prevent that from happening, you have a variety of strategies that you can employ. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about them in a minute. But none of them can really make the problem go away. Essentially, you're just moving the threat around. But this overall problem is structural, and that's why it can't be solved.
Okay, so you said we can talk a little bit more about that. So let's dive into it, because as I mentioned, the regime has been there for not for 5 or 10 or 20 years. It's almost 50. And everyone inside and out is tired of the regime. So we will talk a bit about the external and internal pressures as well. But still, how can we dissect this durability? So this is not a regular case, just as any other cases could be, right? So if there are examples of, if you could help us explain with other examples of the durability, why this is going on for such a long time?
Yeah, so essentially, like I said, the problem is structural. So if you're a dictatorship, if you're at the very top of the system, you can ignore the vast majority of the population. And in a way, that sounds pretty nice. So if you're Kim Jong-un, for example, really all you have to watch is your own military, it's your own intelligence service, it's a couple of dozen families in the capital city. And the vast majority of the rest of the population, you can more or less ignore. And that's because those people don't really have an influence on your continued rule. And that's different from a democracy, for example. In a democracy, you need millions and millions and millions of supporters in order to gain power or to maintain that power. But there's a flip side to that, because if Kim Jong-un loses, a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen of the wrong people in Pyongyang, he's going to lose his power very, very quickly. And if he does, he might not just lose his power, but perhaps also his freedom or even his life. And again, this is different in a democracy. In a democracy, if you're the German chancellor, or you're the French president, or you're the prime minister of the UK, you can lose scores of voters and you can maintain power. And even if you lose power, you are probably going to be okay. And that's very, very different in these types of systems. So the primary threat to almost all of these non-democratic regimes is their own military and it's their own intelligence services. And that's also the case in Iran. So the regime in Tehran knows that the prime threat are not necessarily foreign soldiers, but their own soldiers. And because of that, they've employed a number of strategies in order to keep those soldiers in check. So what you see in Iran, for example, is that you don't just have the regular military, as you might have in a democracy, but you have that regular military, and then you also have revolutionary guards. And in addition to those revolutionary guards, which are kind of paramilitary, you also have a very big militia. And that is very much typical of these regimes, because if you do it that way, you can drastically reduce the chances of a coup because you create these counterweights. So even if a general in the regular Iranian military wants to overthrow the regime in Tehran, he knows that he would have to go through that militia. And he knows that he would have to go through those revolutionary guards. And as a result, it's much less likely that he will actually try to do it. But this is a trade-off. Like I said, you can't really get rid of the threat. You can only move it around. And when you structure your security services in a way that makes coups less likely, you are reducing the effectiveness of your security apparatus. And this is also something that you see in Iran, but you also see it for the Russians. If you build that machine, if you build that security apparatus primarily to not overthrow you, they are going to be worse at actually fighting wars because that's simply not what they're built to do.
So you are saying that the internal fracture is the key to understand what is going to happen in Iran and in authoritarian regimes in general. So if we stay for a bit on the case of Iran, what signs would tell us that people inside the system are beginning to break away? And also you mentioned in your book, Chernovyt's 3.5% threshold. So can you elaborate more on that as well?
Yeah. So predicting what is going to happen in these types of regimes is notoriously difficult because it depends on very few people at the top. So in a democracy, you can poll voters and you can find out more or less what they want and where they stand. But in a regime like Iran or in Russia or in North Korea, where really only the people at the very top matter, it's extremely difficult to figure out what is going on. And as a result, pretty much anything can happen at any moment. So right now, it looks like the Iranian regime is comparatively stable, but we simply don't know because we can't look inside the heads of these 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen people that really call the shots in that country. So what would I be looking for in terms of the regime breaking? What you would expect to see is that perhaps some people in the military apparatus refuse to follow orders, or perhaps they outright defect to a different country, or perhaps you have the open disagreement on the future course or plan that they might want to pursue. Some of those things are happening. So, for example, you see a clear difference between the Foreign Ministry and the Revolutionary Guards when it comes to these negotiations with the United States. But we obviously haven't seen any high-profile defections as of late that would indicate that the machine is really cracking. And in terms of the 3.5% rule, so you are always at risk from your own people, from the masses in the streets. It's usually not the primary threat, but it is always a threat. And again, this comes back to the structure. If you are somebody like Vladimir Putin, for example, and you've got money coming into Moscow that you've stolen in one way or another, it simply doesn't make sense to use that money to look after the broad mass of the population. You don't build that hospital in a Siberian village because what happens in that Siberian village, again, has no influence on your continued rule. So instead, what you do is you take that money that you've stolen and you give it to the oligarchs, or you give it to the military, or you give it to the intelligence officials, because those are the people that will determine whether you stay in power. And as a result of that, you are systematically mistreating your own population. And eventually, when these people can no longer pay rent, or when the economy is crashing, they might rise up. And at that moment, when you've got enough people in the streets, oftentimes it can be enough to break even the most hardened regime.
That's interesting because in Iran's case, sanctions that have been imposed on the country for such a long time, and we've seen moments of popular uprisings, and the recent war. So it's difficult not to imagine that this is not going to somehow have a backlash effect. You also, in your book, you write about if you shoot, you lose, if I'm right. So I want to add a layer to our discussion. It's not only those external pressures that have been imposed on Iran, but also the government, how it treats its own people and uses violence against their own population. So you argue that there is a threshold no government has an ability to overcome and also stay in power. So, how can we explain Iran's? It is difficult to explain Iran's situation while everything is happening at the same time in combination, and it's still the regime holds, as you also mentioned. So, can we talk more a bit on this?
Yeah. So the overall problem here is that as people grow dissatisfied, some of them might turn out into the street. And if you're a democratic leader, you can just ignore people in the streets. I mean, you can look out of your window, take a look at them, and then you can say, okay, whatever, that's fine. I can find new voters. But if you're a dictatorship, you cannot tolerate open dissent because the entire system is built on an impression of invulnerability. You need to be strong, or you need to be seen as strong in order to maintain power. So as these people march in the streets, you have to react. And reacting usually means using violence. So you take clubs, you take your police, and you try to get rid of these people in the streets. But if you beat women and children and pensioners, if things go badly, the very next day you might have even more people in the streets. And if that happens, eventually there might be so many people that the only way to clear the streets is lethal force. And at that moment, you are really forced into a choice between the plague and cholera, as we would say in German. So you have no more good options because you can't let people march. But if you give that order for lethal violence, if you tell your police or your soldiers to actually shoot at these people, they might refuse that order. And at that very moment, when the regime looks the strongest and people look weak because they have no weapons, they have no Molotov cocktails, it's kids, it's pensioners, it's just ordinary people without weapons, oftentimes the regime collapses under the weight of its own repression. Either because the security forces simply refuse to follow orders, or because the regime fractures at the very top. Because some of those people in that elite that have done a lot for the regime and in order to defend it do defect and say, listen, I've gone along with a lot of things, but this is where I draw the line. I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to shoot these unarmed people. But the depressing truth is also that if regimes can maintain brutal violence against their own people for an extended period of time, they can absolutely stay in power, even if the vast majority of the population hates them. So this is something that we've seen in Syria, for example. Assad didn't stay in power because he was popular or because he was, seen as a visionary leader for the country, but simply because he was able to use brute force. He could use chemical weapons, he could use helicopters to bombard ordinary people. And ultimately, he was able to maintain that violence for so long that he was able to stay in power for many more years than he otherwise would have been. So, yes, some of these regimes can be forced from power if you get enough people in the streets, but that only works if the regime isn't able to maintain that violence for a long period of time. And if I can add, this is one of those areas where I think a lot of people lie to ourselves because you often hear in the West, well, you got to win the hearts and minds of the people in order to win conflicts. But if you're a dictatorship, that is simply not true. You can absolutely bomb people into submission.
Well, thank you. I want to touch a little bit also on Trump's thinking about Iran because we've been mentioning so many things that could have brought Iranian regime down, but it still survives, right? So. How did Trump evaluate the situation in Iran? Where did he think was the weakest point in the regime so that he decided to strike?
I mean, I don't know what's going on in Trump's head, but I think basically what Trump thought is that they would assassinate the key leaders in the country, and as a result, you would have a totally different regime. So the regime would fall, perhaps the people would rise up, and as a result, you get something different, and that new regime is something that you can deal with. But obviously, there's a difference between the actual leader and the regime as such. So just because you take out one man doesn't mean that the entire regime is going to fall. And you see that even in Venezuela, for example. Maduro is gone, but the regime as a whole is still in power. And if anything, it might have gotten worse for Venezuelan people because the regime perhaps is even more repressive now on the inside. So I think what they thought was just way over optimistic. And now they've basically retreated to a strategy where they say, well, okay, we're not going to get regime change, but perhaps we can put so much pressure on this regime that they essentially accede to our demands and surrender. And this, I think, is fanciful. Because again, if these people were to lose power, for example, because they make a bad deal, and then there's some sort of coup, they would likely spend the rest of their days in a prison, or perhaps they would even get killed. So the incentives for the leaders in Tehran to do everything possible to stay in power is massive. And pressure is difficult against these regimes because, again, the Iranian regime does not really need the vast majority of the population in order to stay in power. So if ordinary Iranians suffer, is not of great importance to the Iranian regime because they don't need them. It's unlike a democratic system would be.
I see. So even though at the moment we can agree on the fact that Iranian regime is in place and seems stronger, that could be misleading. It is still under pressure. A lot has been happening. We can also talk about Russia being bogged down in Ukraine. Can we still assume that this is a significant moment for authoritarian regimes, that they will look back and make some changes in how they deal with the internal and external pressures? Or can we say that they will just absorb and adapt to it? In other words, is this a turning point or not really?
I think there are two parts of that answer. So the first is Iran in particular. And I think the Iranian regime has very much prepared for this moment. And I think in that regard, the attack last year really made a big difference. So the way that the Iranian regime is set up now is that it's really decentralized. So they knew that their command and control might get taken out. And because of that, what they did is they delegated a lot of power to smaller units. So it's almost like a terrorist organization would work. You essentially have these cells of revolutionary guards. And even if their general gets taken out, they have a target list, they have weapons, and they know what to do. And that makes it much more difficult to stop them from, causing chaos in the Strait of Hormuz, for example. And you have the same on a domestic security angle. So this big militia that we are talking about, when the attacks happened, they fanned out. They went to the mosques, they went to the markets, and they did everything they could in quite an autonomous way. And that makes it much more difficult for Western nations to try to crack the regime because we are focused on taking out people at the very top, thinking that, well, if there's no more brain, then the entire system is going to crumble. But the Iranians knew that, and that's why they prepared for it. And on the general point, I think there's almost an irony here because, of course, leaders like Putin, leaders like Xi, and also the Iranians, they didn't like the liberal international order. They thought that it constrained them and that it reduced their room for maneuver. But really, what they're discovering now is that this new system that is emerging, where these norms and these kind of rules that we had, even though they weren't perfect, but these rules really are no longer around. I mean, we're essentially in a world now where you can do whatever you can do. And the lack of these guardrails, I think, is actually not good for these dictators because ultimately a lot of them are much weaker than they probably thought they would be. And to survive in this new system and in this jungle without all of these guardrails is going to be extremely difficult for some of them. And they will find themselves under pressure or perhaps even removed from power, not necessarily because the Americans or somebody else wants to promote democracy, but simply because they annoy the wrong leader at the wrong time, and that leader really has no more constraints, like Trump now.
Oh, that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you about the liberal international order and if it weakens, does it make the world more dangerous for authoritarian rulers or not? Well, I still want to dwell a little bit on that question. How do you think we can explain that? I mean, you started to explain it, but can you get into the more details of why a system which is not rules-based anymore would be more dangerous rather than accommodating for the authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I mean, let's look at Venezuela, for example. Would Joe Biden have taken out Maduro? Probably not. And that is in part because Joe Biden is somebody who, at least to some extent, tried to pay lip service to this international order that we had. And in that order, it was at least frowned upon to go to somebody else's capital city and kidnap their leader and then bring them back to your own country. That's not to say that it never happened or that rules were always followed, but most of the time, most of the rules were followed. And now that is simply no longer the case. And that gives the Americans, for example, a lot of room for maneuver because they have the most powerful military in the world and they can do things in Venezuela and they can do things in the Middle East and in Africa and in East Asia. But if you're a country like Venezuela or you're a country like Iran, really that international order in a way was almost a protective shield because it meant that even though you are not the most powerful actor in the world, those great powers are limited in what they will likely do to you. And that is now dropping. I mean, Trump does whatever he wants. I mean, Trump is completely unconcerned with any type of international norms that we may have had. And ultimately, that can be quite dangerous and quite threatening to many of these dictators.
I see. So if we imagine that the US is no longer going to play this role of the international protector of the international order and is going to act as a rogue state, just like Russia, for example. Can we make a case for China stepping in, or that would be too much of a stretching? My question is basically, are we at the end of the international world order, or it can be salvaged somehow?
I don't think it's going to be salvaged. No, no. I think the liberal international order is over. I think this sort of what we've had, at least in some parts of the world, since the end of the Cold War, is over. Particularly in Europe, we got used to it. We got very comfortable. We told ourselves that we no longer fight wars. Military power is no longer important, and all of that is over. And I don't think it can be salvaged because if you look at Europe, for example, whether it's Donald Trump or another American president, all of those American presidents down the line are going to focus less on Europe, simply because Europe is less important to the Americans than it used to be. And there's inevitably going to be a lot more interest on Asia because of the rise of China. So even if Donald Trump is no longer in power and there's some other president, we are going to have to do more for our own security either way. And the structural factor of American withdrawal is gonna take the lid of, sort of a lot of the conflicts that have sort of been dormant, let's say, or that have been less intense because of American involvement. So no, I think the liberal international order is dead. I don't think China really has an interest in resurrecting it because, I mean, China is a dictatorship and, they're not interested in these norms either. And the US can't be replaced. I mean, love them or hate them, they're an integral part of the system. And as they withdraw, they can't be replaced.
Yeah, but there are some arguments that China has immensely benefited from the international order. So if it's gone, how can we imagine the world and China's rising in this world? So is it also going to go together with the world order down the drain, or that's too early to talk about?
Well, I think for China, this is probably less problematic than it would be for some other dictatorships. And that's because China is extremely powerful. So yes, China is going to have trouble, taking military action in the Caribbean or somewhere in West Africa or in the Middle East. But China is an incredibly powerful country with a huge economy and a huge military. And in this jungle, they are a lot better positioned to fight and to advance their interests than a lot of these other dictatorships like Venezuela would be, or like Iran would be, or like even Russia would be. So for the Chinese, yes, it means that things are really changing, but I think it's less problematic for them than it would be for some of these middle powers or some of these smaller dictatorships.
Okay. Before I have one last question about Iran, but before I go to that question, I want to stay a little bit. You mentioned Europe, and I want to stay a little bit on this topic. So, in your book, you talk about how Western governments have often been complicit in sustaining non-democratic regimes, and they have often looked away when it's suited them. So, can we say it is changing now, or not really?
I think it's likely going to get worse because a lot of European countries, like I said, have gotten very comfortable and have started to actually believe in this idea that military power is less important than it used to be, and that they are more or less safe, and that there are no significant threats. Of course, this isn't true for all European countries. I mean, the outlook in Poland or the Baltic states was always very different from the outlook in Portugal or Germany, or perhaps, something like the Netherlands. But that is clearly over, and that is something that Europeans have understood. And previously, when they did engage with these non-democratic actors and supported them, it was in the name of economic growth. So they wanted their companies to do well, they wanted to export, and that led them to turn a blind eye to some of these dictatorships, or perhaps to actively support them. But now things are much more urgent, because a lot of this is now no longer about the economy, but it's about national security. And national security trumps just about everything else when it comes to the way that these foreign policies are structured. So I think if anything, it's going to get worse, and we are going to see more cooperation between European democracies and dictatorships around the world.
And how, I hadn't planned to ask this question, but it's really interesting. How do you think that's going to affect democracies in the West? They are not going to draw out. I'll let you answer this question without.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you basically see is that as we support these dictatorships, as we support these non-democratic regimes, we don't remain unscathed. We see, for example, that dictatorial capital coming in. There's barely a European football club, for example, that isn't financed by some oligarch or by some dictatorship or by some Gulf monarchy. And that obviously has an impact on our own societies, and that has an impact on the way that we make foreign policy. So there's a path dependency to this. So once you start going down this road, and once you get closer to these regimes and they become more entangled in your societies, it becomes harder and harder to reverse course and to change your policy. So I think it is going to have an impact on our own societies, and it's going to have an impact on our own democracy, and it's going to be a corrupting one. It's not going to be good.
And how is it going to have an impact on scholarship? Because I feel like it is already increasingly difficult to talk about things and write about things that are controversial. So what's your experience, and what do you envision in the future?
I mean, I think as these regimes gain more influence in our own societies, it's going to be more difficult to, tell the truth to power, and to study these places in an impartial way. And a lot of this, of course, is also about funding, right? I mean, if you get your funding from a Gulf monarchy and you study the Middle East, you have an incentive to perhaps study different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change the results of what you found out, but perhaps you don't look at those human rights abuses. Perhaps you do look at the economy and innovation in those places. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to have a corrupting impact overall, and the academy is not safe.
I see. Thank you. Well, this is my final question about the aftermath of the um, Iranian regime. What can we imagine after it falls, when it falls? Because eventually it will fall, of course. So I will just put this question in the context, because when the attack on Iran started, there were numerous reasons named, nuclear, military, but there was also democracy mentioned. And can we imagine that Iran turns into a democracy after the regime falls? What are the examples in the immediate neighborhood, and also maybe other examples that could help us understand what's the aftermath going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always possible, but the likeliest scenario, if this regime were to fall, is that it's replaced with another dictatorship of some kind. So perhaps it turns from a theocracy into a military dictatorship because the Revolutionary Guards take over, and There's no longer this sort of legitimacy that's derived from religion, but it's just kind of a more ordinary military junta going forward. So a new dictatorship is the most likeliest scenario if this regime falls. But of course, democracy is always a possibility. And in fact, Iran has a number of advantages going for it. So this is a regime, this is a country with a highly educated population, and they do have some experience of democracy. And we know from the literature that this is one of the things that makes democratization much more likely. Also, this is a country that in some ways functions. I mean, there are functioning institutions in Iran. And again, we know from research that this is something that also makes future democratization much more likely. So if this regime were to fall, another dictatorship would be the most likely outcome. But a democratization is much more likely in Iran than it would be in a country like Afghanistan, for example, which really doesn't have that experience and also doesn't have those institutions that make democratization more likely.
Well, thank you. This is quite an optimistic note, I think, to end on, because most of the times when Iran is discussed, examples of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria are brought in, and there is almost no room to imagine a democratic Iran. So this is an interesting perspective, I think, and we should pause on that probably. Thank you, Marcel, for this extraordinary interview. I think this was interesting and insightful.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, I hope you will agree for the next time whenever the occasion arises.
Sure. Thank you.
I will definitely recommend your podcast to our listeners as well. The Next Best. Check it out. Well, thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. You too.